The porcelain espresso cup sitting on the dark walnut table had a hairline fracture right near the base of its delicate handle, a tiny, jagged imperfection in an otherwise flawless environment. It was an insignificant detail, entirely mundane, but my brain latched onto it with the immediate, ruthless calculation that defined my entire existence. The Chicago bistro around us was humming with the low, even frequency of mid-morning corporate commerce, insulated from the biting, freezing rain outside by massive panes of double-reinforced glass. I kept my hands resting lightly on my thighs, feeling the familiar, hollow quiet of my own absolute isolation settling over me. I trusted numbers, algorithms, and immutable server logs. I did not trust people. People were variables. People lied. Then, Aurora Evans shifted in her chair, the subtle friction of her wool coat against the leather booth creating a soft sound, and the geometric reality of the room fundamentally shifted. She sat directly across from me, framed by the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out onto the gray, rain-slicked grid of the city skyline. She wore a deep emerald green V-neck blouse that sharply contrasted with the immaculate sculpted waves of her blonde hair. Her posture was a masterclass in controlled tension, the kind of rigidity that only comes from someone used to carrying the weight of $1 billion division on her shoulders. She was 36, a half-decade older than me, and possessed a formidable reputation in the financial district that usually preceded her like a shockwave. Right now, though, she was leaning forward slightly, her chin resting against her knuckles. Her expression was an unreadable mask of corporate composure, but the striking red lipstick she wore couldn't quite camouflage the microscopic tremor at the corner of her jaw. "This is a blind spot for the cameras," she said. Her voice was low, carrying the steady, resonant frequency of a woman who was entirely accustomed to commanding boardrooms. But right now, it held an undercurrent of absolute grinding necessity. I didn't bother looking up at the ceiling. I already knew she was right. I understood exactly why she had brought me to this specific table, tucked beneath the architectural overhang of the window frame. It perfectly occluded the security dome positioned above the barista station. "You're thorough," I observed, my tone perfectly level, betraying none of the sudden, sharp focus dialing in behind my eyes. "But you didn't hire an independent forensic auditor at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday just to test my situational awareness." Aurora didn't smile. She lowered her hand from her chin and reached into the structured leather tote bag resting against the leg of her chair. She withdrew a single, thick, white envelope and placed it on the polished wood of the table. Using only her index and middle fingers, she slid it forward. The paper made a quiet scraping sound against the wood. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my hand. "They locked me out of the primary corporate servers at 8 o'clock this morning," she stated, her gaze never leaving mine, her eyes a sharp, stormy blue. By 9, Marcus had an emergency HR preliminary inquiry scheduled for Thursday afternoon. He's alleging a gross breach of confidentiality. Someone mirrored the Vanguard merger files from my terminal, Jackson. The timestamp logs and the internal IP routing point directly to my administrative credentials. I am being framed for corporate sabotage. I looked down at the envelope. I didn't touch it. In my specific line of work, touching the evidence was a physical agreement to enter the war. People brought me the corporate disasters they couldn't clean up with lawyers alone. I dealt in server access logs, metadata extraction, encrypted ledgers, and the quiet, methodical destruction of false narratives. "If Marcus used a mirrored drive to pull those files," I said, my mind already building the procedural flowchart, isolating the variables, "he had to bypass the two-factor authentication assigned to your specific terminal. That means he either cloned your physical NFC keycard or he intercepted the SMS token during a system-wide update. He couldn't just guess a password." Aurora's eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only tell she gave that I had perfectly diagnosed the mechanism of her ruin in less than 30 seconds. The tension in her neck seemed to vibrate. "Can you trace it?" she asked, her voice dropping another decibel, the sound barely carrying over the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. "I don't trace things," I told her, my voice quiet, stripped of any arrogance, delivering only facts. I reached out and laid my hand flat over the envelope, feeling the sudden grounding weight of the thick paper. "I extract the reality that is already mathematically present in the code. I will be your witness and your technical escort for the HR preliminary on Thursday. You will say absolutely nothing in that room until I speak." The tension in her shoulders didn't disappear, but it fundamentally changed shape. The chaotic spinning panic of being cornered in a corporate trap suddenly settled into the heavy, grounded reality of having a shieldmate. She let out a long, slow breath that ruffled the edge of a napkin on the table. We had an arrangement. The next 48 hours were a brutal exercise in endurance. The silence of my downtown apartment was entirely replaced by the relentless, rhythmic clatter of my mechanical keyboard. I had converted my dining table into a war room. The harsh, blue glow of 3 high-resolution monitors cut through the darkness of the Chicago night, illuminating thousands of lines of raw, unparsed server data. Outside, the rain continued to batter the glass, a constant, static roar. Aurora sat on my charcoal sofa 10 feet away, buried under a mountain of printed corporate bylaws, physical employee handbook addendums, and cold cartons of Chinese takeout. She had refused to go home. I hadn't asked her to leave. The proximity was strictly functional, entirely professional, but the air in the room felt incredibly dense, heavy with a shared, silent focus. My career obsession usually pushed people away, leaving me in a vacuum of my own making, but right now, that exact obsession was the only thing keeping her afloat. "I've isolated the subnet mask routing protocols," I said quietly, not looking away from the center screen, my eyes burning from the glare. The data payload wasn't transferred via the primary firewall at all. Whoever did this was smart, but not smart enough. They piggybacked the file transfer onto a routine server security patch deployed by the IT department at 0200 hours on Sunday. I heard the sharp rustle of paper as she set down a yellow highlighter. Her footsteps were quiet, almost soundless on the hardwood floor as she walked over to stand behind my chair. I could smell a faint trace of rain, vanilla, and the crisp scent of expensive paper radiating from her clothes. My hands instinctively tightened on the keyboard, my knuckles turning white for a fraction of a second before I forced my fingers to relax, commanding my muscles to uncoil. I kept my gaze locked firmly forward. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to look at her to see if the exhaustion was pulling at the corners of her eyes, but restraint was the only currency I had to prove that she was safe in my space. "Marcus isn't technically literate enough to spoof a MAC address on a secure subnetwork," she said, leaning in slightly to read the scrolling text on the monitor. Her voice was steady, processing the logic. "He didn't have to be," I replied, hitting a rapid sequence of keystrokes that unspooled a wall of green text into a clean, readable, formatted spreadsheet. He outsourced the technical execution, but he was sloppy with the payment trail. The proxy server he routed the data through was registered in a blind trust in Delaware, but the billing metadata, the digital fingerprint left by the transaction, is linked to a corporate expense card issued directly to his specific division. Aurora let out a slow, shaky exhale. It wasn't a sound of triumph. It was the sound of a woman realizing she wasn't crazy, the sound of a heavy weight shifting just a fraction of an inch off her chest. "We have him," she whispered, her voice tight. "We have a highly probable theory," I corrected gently, turning my chair just enough to look at her, but maintaining a rigid, deliberate 3-foot boundary between us. To make it an actionable, undeniable fact, I need to force HR to pull the physical door access logs for the sub-basement server room during that specific update window. If his keycard swiped within 10 minutes of that patch deployment, the data leak accusation against you collapses entirely. She looked at me, her eyes lined with the distinct, bruising fatigue of a prolonged, unfair battle. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air for a second before she placed her fingers lightly on the edge of my wooden desk. It was a purely functional anchor, a physical way to ground herself against the spinning room. "Thank you, Jackson," she said, her voice stripped of all its polished corporate armor, leaving only a raw, quiet honesty. I looked at her hand resting on the wood, tracking the pale line of a small faded scar near her knuckle, then up to her face. I felt an intense, sudden pull in my chest, an almost overwhelming urge to reach out and cover her hand with mine, to offer a comfort that exceeded the strict bounds of our contract. I didn't. I shoved my hands deeply into the pockets of my dark trousers, my jaw clenching. I held my posture perfectly still. "Get some sleep, Aurora," I said, my voice quiet but laced with absolute firmness. "Thursday is going to be a bloodbath in that room, and I need you sharp." Thursday afternoon arrived with the biting, hostile chill of a true Chicago winter. The HR conference room on the 42nd floor of the Vanguard building was a sterile glass box that smelled of ozone, ammonia glass cleaner, and institutional hostility. The ambient temperature was set aggressively low. Davis, the lead compliance officer, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a thick manila folder resting squarely in front of him. Marcus sat to his right. Marcus wore a bespoke suit that cost more than my car, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with the relaxed, arrogant posture of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war and was simply waiting for the execution. Aurora and I walked into the room together, our footsteps synchronized. I pulled her chair out for her, a simple logistical courtesy, offering a physical buffer before taking the seat immediately to her left. I placed my closed laptop on the table. I didn't open it. I folded my hands over the cold aluminum casing and looked directly at Davis, my face an unreadable mask. "Miss Evans," Davis began, his tone dripping with the practiced hollow neutrality of a corporate executioner reading a sentence. "The IT network security logs show a massive, unauthorized data packet transfer originating from your assigned IP address at precisely 2 a.m. on Sunday. This constitutes a direct, fireable violation of—" "Mr. Davis," I interrupted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I didn't have to. The absolute flat certainty in my tone cut through the manufactured authority of the room like a surgical scalpel. Marcus scoffed loudly, sitting forward, his arrogance slipping just a fraction. "Who the hell let the accountant speak in a closed disciplinary hearing?" I didn't even look at Marcus. I kept my eyes locked entirely, unblinkingly, on Davis. The IP address is functionally irrelevant to establishing identity. If you review the secondary subnet routing logs, which I have taken the liberty of subpoenaing through a third-party arbitration clause invoked at 8 a.m. this morning, you will find the MAC address of the initiating device does not, in fact, match Ms. Evans's assigned workstation. I opened my laptop. The screen flared to life. I didn't look at the keyboard as I typed my encrypted password. My fingers knew the choreography by muscle memory. I spun the machine around and pushed it precisely to the center of the table, the screen facing Davis. The data transfer was initiated from a temporary, unassigned terminal located in the sub-basement server room, I stated, my voice echoing slightly against the glass walls. Furthermore, the timestamp aligns exactly with a routine security patch. Someone knew that specific 10-minute vulnerability window existed, and they used it to bypass the dual authentication protocols. Davis frowned deeply, pulling his reading glasses down from his forehead, leaning forward to scrutinize the scrolling green data on the screen. The color began to visibly drain from his face as he read the irrefutable server logs. "This is pure conjecture," Marcus snapped, his voice rising in pitch, a sharp edge of panic bleeding into his tone. She leaked the Vanguard merger files to kill the deal because she didn't get the VP slot. I finally turned my head. I looked at Marcus. I read the raw, animal panic hiding in the tight corners of his eyes. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and produced a single, physically printed piece of heavy stock paper. I placed it flat on the mahogany table. This is the physical security access log for the sub-basement server room, provided directly by the building management company, completely independent of your internal IT department, I said calmly. It shows a physical keycard swipe at 1:58 a.m. on Sunday, exactly 2 minutes before the data breach was initiated. I tapped the paper twice with my index finger, the sound loud like a gunshot. The serial number on that card is registered to you, Marcus. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating, atmospheric silence of a steel trap snapping shut on a limb. I turned back to Davis, negotiating the boundary of power with cold precision. This preliminary inquiry regarding Ms. Evans is permanently paused. I highly suggest you redirect your remaining compliance resources toward the individual sitting immediately to your right. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive click. I stood up, adjusting my cuffs. Aurora stood with me, her movements smooth and unhurried. We didn't wait to be formally dismissed by Davis. We walked out of the room, leaving the smoking wreckage of Marcus's ambition burning on the table behind us. In the elevator ride down to the lobby, the descent was smooth and mechanically soundless. Aurora stood beside me, staring straight ahead at her own reflection in the brushed steel doors. I watched the digital floor numbers tick down in the corner of my eye. 40, 35, 30. Suddenly, as we passed the 20th floor, her knees buckled slightly. The massive, sustained surge of adrenaline that had been holding her upright for a week was violently crashing, leaving nothing but a hollow, shaking exhaustion in its wake. I moved instinctively before conscious thought even registered. I reached out, gripping her upper arm just below the shoulder with a firm, steadying hold. I didn't pull her into me. I didn't compromise her space. I simply provided the absolute structural support her body was temporarily lacking. My grip was a stabilizer, a physical grounding wire transferring my own steady, regulated calm directly into her spinning panic. She let out a long, ragged breath, her free hand coming up to grip my wrist tightly, her manicured nails biting slightly into my skin. "I've got you," I said quietly, the words a concrete, logistical promise, not a romantic platitude. The world stopped spinning for a second. The elevator car became a quiet room, blocking out the noise of the corporation above us. "He's going to retaliate," she whispered, looking up at me, the steel doors reflecting the harsh, cold overhead light in her tired eyes. "He has an acceleration clause built into his contract. If he's actively investigated by HR, he can trigger an emergency board vote on the Vanguard merger within 5 days. He's going to force the deal through before the compliance officers can finish verifying your report." I didn't let go of her arm until I felt the tension return to her legs, ensuring she was standing firmly on her own 2 feet. I deliberately stepped back, restoring the professional boundary, but I didn't break eye contact. "Then we don't wait for HR," I told her, my voice turning to steel. "We audit the Vanguard merger ourselves. Tonight. We find the financial rot he's trying to hide, the reason he's pushing this so hard, and we kill the deal on the floor." The next 4 days systematically redefined the concept of human endurance. We moved my operation out of my apartment and directly into her corner office. The vast, elegant space quickly became a barricaded fortress of printed ledgers, highlighters, and cold cups of black coffee. The corporate world outside continued to spin, the city lights blinking on and off, entirely unaware of the methodical, forensic dismantling of a billion-dollar merger happening behind her locked oak doors. We fell into a rhythm of silent, desperate efficiency. I was buried deep in the Vanguard asset valuation ledgers, running complex, multivariable depreciation models to stress test their reported quarterly earnings. She was sitting on the floor surrounded by files, cross-referencing my raw data against internal board communications and emails she had archived months ago. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city below was a sprawling, wet grid of gold and white lights. The only sound in the office was the hum of the HVAC system and the scratch of my pen. I was rubbing my temples, a dull, rhythmic ache throbbing behind my eyes from staring at tiny numerical discrepancies for 14 hours straight. My career obsession, the flaw that had ruined my past relationships, was the only engine powerful enough to keep me conscious right now. A heavy ceramic mug slid into my peripheral vision, settling onto the glass desk right next to my legal pad. I looked up. Aurora was standing there, holding her own mug. Her hair was pulled back into a messy clip, her blazer discarded hours ago. "Drink it," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command born of care. I picked up the coffee. It was black, dark roast, exactly how I took it, though I had never explicitly told her that preference. She had simply observed it over the last week. I took a sip. The bitter heat was a sudden, sharp comfort against the cold exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I placed my phone face down on the desk, turning my entire focus away from the screens and entirely onto her. "You found something," she observed quietly, looking at the way I had aggressively circled a specific column of numbers in red ink until the paper had nearly torn. "Vanguard is massively over-leveraged," I explained, tapping the legal pad with my pen. "They're hiding enormous short-term debt obligations in a series of nested subsidiary holding companies. Marcus knows this. If the merger goes through, our firm legally absorbs that toxic debt, and Vanguard's executives parachute out with their inflated stock options. It's a corporate smash and grab disguised as a synergy merger." Aurora looked at the numbers, her brow furrowing. "We need the original subsidiary incorporation documents to prove they are wholly owned by Vanguard. Without the hard physical paper proving the chain of ownership, it's just your projection models against their army of accountants. And Marcus has the board's ear." "The physical documents are stored in an off-site archiving facility," I said, checking my watch. "It's a secured warehouse in the industrial district. But Marcus had IT freeze your authorization codes." "He froze my digital codes," she corrected, a sharp, sudden edge entering her voice. She walked over to her desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a heavy brass ring holding 3 physical keys. "He didn't freeze these." We drove in complete silence. The rain had returned with a vengeance, lashing against the windshield of my car in angry, rhythmic sheets, the wiper blades struggling to keep up. The industrial district was a ghost town of massive concrete warehouses, chain-link fences, and flickering, dying amber streetlights. We pulled up to the archiving facility. It was a brutalist, windowless block of concrete with a single heavy steel door. Aurora killed the engine. The sudden absence of the motor noise made the sound of the rain hammering the roof deafening. The car interior was cold. She looked at the brass keys in her hand, then looked out at the dark, imposing building. Her fingers were trembling. "If we go in there and take those boxes and Marcus finds out before the board meeting tomorrow morning, he can have us arrested for corporate espionage. This crosses a line, Jackson." I put the car in park. I unbuckled my seatbelt, the click loud in the small space, and turned my body to face her fully. I saw the fear in her eyes, the completely rational, logical terror of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff about to risk everything she had built over a decade. This was the midpoint, the moment where the pressure threatened to crush her. "Aurora," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the storm, steady and absolute. I have spent my entire adult life building impenetrable systems to protect people from chaos. I have never, not once, lost a client to a false narrative. I am not going to lose you. I will take the heat if the alarm trips. You just find the box. She stared at me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and profound. She wasn't just looking at a hired forensic accountant anymore. She was looking at a partner. She was looking at the only person in the entire city who hadn't asked her to compromise or shrink herself. She gave a single, sharp nod. She opened her door and stepped out into the freezing rain. I followed. The inside of the warehouse was a cavernous grid of steel shelving units and thousands of identical cardboard boxes, smelling of dry dust, old paper, and industrial floor wax. We worked solely by the narrow beam of my heavy-duty flashlight. It took 2 grueling hours of hauling heavy banker's boxes off the top racks, our hands covered in thick grime, the damp, cold air biting harshly at our lungs. My muscles ached with every lift, but I didn't stop. I took the heaviest loads, pulling them down so she could scan the labels. Finally, on aisle 14, I ripped open a box marked Vanguard Holdings, Master Structuring, 2022. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal documents. I shined the harsh LED light directly onto the first page. Got it, I breathed, the words forming a fleeting cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. Articles of incorporation, proof of wholly owned subsidiaries, signatures included. We hauled the critical boxes back out to the car, throwing them into the back seat. We were both soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and covered in streaks of warehouse dust. I threw the car into gear, locking the doors, and blasted the heater to maximum. We sat in the dark parking lot for a minute, the thermal shock of the hot air making my skin prickle uncomfortably. Aurora was staring blindly at the boxes in the back. Suddenly she let out a sound. It wasn't a cry. It was a broken, exhausted half-laugh of someone who had just survived a high-speed collision. The vulnerability of the moment broke through her defenses. She turned to me. Her blonde hair was plastered wetly to her forehead, her pristine makeup slightly smudged under her eyes. She had never looked more formidable, more real, than she did in that exact second. I felt a tightening in my throat, an ache that had nothing to do with the cold. I wanted to pull her against me, to wrap my coat around her, but I forced my hands to remain gripping the steering wheel. I would not mistake adrenaline for an invitation. She reached across the center console. She didn't hand me a file. She didn't point at the road. She simply reached out and rested her cold, shaking hand directly on top of my right hand, where it was still gripping the gear shift. The contact sent a shockwave of absolute defining stillness through my nervous system. I stopped breathing for a second. The chaotic world outside the car, the pounding rain, the looming merger, the hostile board meeting, simply ceased to exist. The physical touch acted as a massive, heavy shield, instantly blocking out the noise of the threat. I didn't turn my hand over. I didn't interlock our fingers. I simply stayed perfectly still, allowing my steady, measured pulse to act as a physical grounding wire, absorbing her tremors until her hand grew still against mine. We sat like that for a full 2 minutes in the quiet hum of the heater, the silence acting as a sanctuary we had built together in the dark. The morning of the board meeting was an exercise in high-stakes psychological warfare. The executive boardroom was a vast, intimidating expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass and polished mahogany, filled with 20 of the wealthiest, most powerful decision-makers in the firm. The air was thick with expensive cologne and tension. Marcus was standing at the front podium, projecting the final, glossy financial slides of the Vanguard merger onto the main screen. He was speaking smoothly about market synergy and aggressive quarterly growth, his voice dripping with persuasive charisma. Aurora and I sat at the very back of the room near the doors, We had walked in exactly 5 minutes after the meeting started, carrying nothing but a single, heavy black leather briefcase. When Marcus finished his slick presentation to a round of polite nods, the board chairman, a stern, unsmiling man with iron white hair, leaned forward and tapped his microphone. "Are there any final objections or comments before we move to a formal, binding vote on the acquisition?" Aurora stood up. She smoothed the front of her navy blazer with one hand, a gesture of pure control. She didn't even glance at Marcus. She looked directly at the chairman, her posture perfect. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice ringing out across the massive room with absolute, undeniable authority, "I move to formally reject the merger proposal in its entirety, pending an immediate external SEC investigation into Vanguard's fraudulent asset reporting and debt concealment." The room erupted into a sudden, chaotic murmur of shock and offense. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. "This is completely outrageous," Marcus shouted, abandoning his microphone and pointing a finger at her. "She is a disgruntled employee operating under an active HR investigation. She has absolutely no standing in this room." I stood up slowly. I picked up the heavy briefcase, placed it flat on the mahogany table, and popped the brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots, silencing the murmurs instantly. The HR investigation was suspended indefinitely. "As Mr. Marcus is well aware," I stated, my voice projected clearly and calmly across the space, offering no emotion, only gravity. I pulled out the thick stack of original ink-stamped incorporation documents we had pulled from the freezing warehouse hours ago. I walked down the length of the table, ignoring the stares of the board members, and placed the heavy stack of documents directly in front of the chairman. "These are the original, legally binding filings for 3 offshore holding companies, proven here to be wholly owned and operated by Vanguard," I explained, methodically mapping the trap for everyone to see. "They contain over $400 million in hidden, short-term toxic debt. If you sign this merger today, you are legally absorbing that liability." Mr. Marcus knew this, and he attempted to electronically frame and silence Ms. Evans to push the deal through before the mandated quarterly audit could uncover the rot. The chairman put on his reading glasses. He looked at the first page. He flipped to the second, checking the signatures. The silence in the room became thick, heavy, and weaponized. The climax wrapper was fully engaged. The contract Marcus had built his entire career on was dead on the table. "Marcus," the chairman said softly, his voice colder than the ice forming on Lake Michigan outside, "explain this. Now." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the damning documents, then at the chairman, and finally at Aurora. The panic in his eyes was absolute and total. He had no leverage left. The math, the cold, hard reality of the numbers, had trapped him. "Security," the chairman said into his microphone, his tone final. "Please escort Mr. Marcus out of the building immediately, and contact legal to freeze his corporate accounts." It was over. The collapse of the threat was total, public, and immediate. 2 hours later, we were back in Aurora's office. The intense morning storm had finally broken, and the sun had pierced through the heavy clouds, casting a sharp golden light across the Chicago skyline and warming the glass of the windows. The boxes of documents were gone, handed over to the firm's ruthless legal team. The tension that had choked the room for weeks was absent, replaced by a strange, quiet emptiness. The falling action had arrived. Aurora was standing by the window, looking out at the city she had just saved her place in. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't looking at a screen. She wasn't twisting her ring. She was just breathing, deeply and freely. I was at the desk, methodically packing my laptop and cables into my leather bag. My job here was done. The contract was fulfilled. The numbers were balanced. The void in my life was waiting for me back at my apartment. I zipped the bag shut and slung it over my shoulder. I walked toward the heavy oak door. "Jackson," she said. I stopped. I turned around, my hand resting on the brass doorknob. She walked across the room, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of me. The imposing corporate armor was completely gone. She looked exhausted, victorious, and incredibly, strikingly, real. "You're leaving," she stated, her tone flat, stating a fact rather than asking a question. "The audit is closed," I replied, my voice quiet, fighting the sudden, fierce urge to drop my bag and stay. "The threat is neutralized. You have your career back. My presence here is no longer a logistical requirement." She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She pulled out a small silver key. She held it out to me, her palm open. "This is the spare key to my apartment," she said. Her hand wasn't shaking anymore. Her eyes were locked onto mine with a fierce, terrifying clarity that stripped away every defense I had left. "I don't need a forensic accountant anymore, Jackson. I need the man who stood in the freezing rain with me when everyone else walked away." I looked at the key resting in her palm. It wasn't just a piece of cut metal. It was a structural shift. It was a permanent, concrete choice. It was an invitation to stop running. I reached out and took the key. My fingers brushed the warmth of her palm, and this time, I didn't pull back. I didn't retreat into my discipline. I closed my hand over the metal, feeling the hard reality of it biting into my skin. It felt like dropping a massive, heavy anchor into a turbulent, endless sea. The chaotic, endless drifting of my life, the isolation I had built my career upon, stopped completely. This was an arrival. I let my bag slide off my shoulder, hitting the floor with a soft thud. I took a half step forward, closing the final distance between us. I reached up, my hand trembling just slightly for the first time in years, and gently rested my palm against the side of her face. My thumb brushed against her cheekbone, a soft, protective gesture that contained no demand, only a heavy, grounding promise. She closed her eyes and leaned her weight into my palm, letting out a soft, almost inaudible sigh of total relief. The world outside the glass didn't matter anymore. I leaned down and pressed my lips firmly to her forehead. It was a single, grounding kiss. It wasn't a frantic exploration. It was a destination. It was a seal on a contract we had written in silence, in shared coffee, and in late-night data logs over the last 6 weeks. It meant she was safe. It meant I was finally home. Closing thoughts. I learned that true integrity isn't just about refusing to cheat the system when people are watching. It's about building a foundation of truth so solid that when the world tries to shake you, you simply do not break. Real partnership isn't found in dramatic, chaotic passion or grand speeches. It is found in the quiet, consistent actions of showing up, standing in the storm, and being the one person who refuses to let go. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.